He fixed a $40 million race car overnight. Then she fired him in front of everyone and threw his toolbox across the floor. He got down on his knees and picked up every single tool without saying a word. Buddy in that garage knew they had just humiliated the man who built the engine they couldn't fix. Knew that because of what she did that morning, 9 drivers were about to climb into cars that could them. This is the story of a man everyone stopped seeing, and what happened when the truth finally refused to stay buried. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that actually matter get told. Stories about quiet people who carry enormous weight and never ask anyone to notice. That's the kind of story that keeps you up at night. You're in the right place. And do me a favor, drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels now. Let's go back to the beginning. The garage at Apex Dominion Racing smelled the way it always did: motor oil, burned rubber, and the particular kind of tension that only exists when a lot of money is at stake and nobody can figure out what went wrong. It was 6:47 in the morning thingin' when Sloane Merrick walked through the main bay doors, and the first thing she noticed was that the overhead lights above car 7 were already on. The second thing she noticed was that someone was underneath it. She stopped walking. 41 engineers had logged a combined 230 hours over the past 4 days trying to diagnose a failure in the prototype's engine. Car was supposed to run qualifying in 72 hours low. Instead, it sat on its jack stands like a $40 million paperweight, and her engineering director, Graham Rourke, had spent 3 of those 4 days telling her they were close and almost there and just need a little more time. She was done with close. She crossed the floor in long strides, heels clicking against the polished concrete, and crouched down beside the car. The person underneath wasn't one of her engineers, was a maintenance worker. She recognized the dark green coveralls, the kind her facilities staff wore. He had a standard issue flashlight propped against the undercarriage, and he was doing something careful and deliberate with a small tool she couldn't immediately identify. She said, "Nothing." "Hey," louder. The man slid out from under the car with the unhurried movement of someone who had been interrupted before and wasn't particularly rattled by it. He was in his early 30s, maybe. Dark hair, slightly too long, pushed back like he'd done it with his hand 100 times that morning. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not unfriendly, just contained, like he'd learned a long time ago, to keep things behind the glass. He sat up, looked at her, and said, "Morning, Meenam." Just that. Morning. Like he was checking in for a shift, not crouched under her $40 million racing prototype. Sloane's voice came out flat. "Who authorized you to touch this car?" "Body," he said. She waited for more. There wasn't any. "Your maintenance," she said. The word came out the way it wasn't supposed to, clipped, dismissive. She'd hear it back later and feel bad about it. But right now she was tired and scared and trying not to show either one. "You're not authorized to be near this vehicle, let alone under it." "I know that," he said. He set down the small tool. It looked like a specialized pick, not standard issue anything. "The injector seal on cylinder 4 is failing. It only leaks when the engine hits temperature above about 280 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why your diagnostic team kept getting clean readings on a cold block." He paused. "I replaced it." Sloane stared at him. She stopped, started again. "You replaced a component on a $40 million prototype, without authorization." "Yes." She stood up slowly. "What's your name?" "Nolan Keats." She pulled out her phone, opened the facility's roster, and scrolled until she found him. Keats. Maintenance and general operations. 3 years of employment. Performance record satisfactory. No flags, no complaints. Just a man who unclogged drains and repaired broken equipment, and apparently, at some point between yesterday evening and this morning, had decided to open up her most valuable piece of machinery. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," she said. He stood up. He was taller than she'd expected, not unusually so, but he had a kind of stillness about him that made people feel his presence more than his height. He tucked the flashlight under his arm and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Defiance, not apology, something quieter than both. "Before I do," he said, "I need to tell you something." You need to... There are 4 other seals showing the same stress pattern. He said it without urgency, which somehow made it land harder. 2 on cylinder 6, 1 on cylinder 2, and 1 on the primary fuel line junction. The way they're positioned, they'll hold through warm-up, and probably through the first 2 laps. When the engine sustains high temperatures for 12 or more minutes,
He stopped.
your driver will have a serious problem. The garage was quiet. Somewhere across the floor, a phone rang twice and stopped. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for your concern. Please step back from the vehicle." Graham Rourke arrived at 7:15, coffee in hand, and Sloane met him at the door with a look he'd learned to read over 8 years of working together. "We have a problem," she said. She told him about the maintenance worker, about the seal, about the claim regarding the other 4. Graham listened with the particular expression of man who was carefully controlling his reaction. He had a square jaw, silver at his temples, and the easy authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades being the smartest person in most rooms. He wore it like a piece of clothing, effortless, unconscious, slightly suffocating if you were standing too close. "Sloane," he said, setting his coffees down on the bench beside him. "Understand you're stressed. We all are. But what you're describing is a maintenance worker with no engineering credentials opening up our prototype car without authorization, tampering with sealed components, and then telling you that 40 of our best engineers missed something he spotted in the dark." He let that sit for a second. "Do you hear how that sounds?" He described the failure accurately. He may have looked something up. He may have heard the team talking. He may have gotten lucky. Graham folded his arms. "What he absolutely did was violate every safety and access protocol we have. And if you let that stand, if you allow it to be known that an unauthorized person tampered with our car and faced no consequences, you will not be able to enforce a single protocol in this building ever again." She heard him. She understood the logic. The problem was that the logic felt clean in a way that the situation didn't. "What about the 4 seals?" she said. "We'll inspect them," Graham said. "Our engineers properly." He picked his coffee back up. "In the meantime, I strongly recommend we have a very direct conversation with Mr. Keats about what he did and why it can never happen again." They brought Nolan into the main bay at 8:30. Half the engineering staff was present, not because anyone had called a meeting, but because news moves fast in a building where everyone is already anxious, and a maintenance man getting summoned to the engineering floor was unusual enough to draw attention. Sloane did most of the talking. She was fair, she thought. She explained the protocols. She acknowledged that his intentions appeared to be genuine. She told him that unauthorized access to restricted vehicles was grounds for immediate termination. Nolan listened without interrupting. His hands were at his sides. He wasn't clenching them, but he wasn't relaxed either. He looked like a man who had already decided how he was going to handle whatever came next. "Do you understand why we can't allow this?" she asked. "I understand why you think you can't," he said. Graham stepped forward. "That's a clever answer. Let me ask a clearer question. Do you have any formal engineering qualifications?" "I do," Nolan said. Graham paused. That wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. "From where?" "MIT. Mechanical engineering, with a focus on thermal dynamics and combustion systems." He said it the same way it said everything else. No pride, no performance. "Just a fact. I have a master's as well. Same institution." The room shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just the quiet, physical way a group of people recalibrates when information arrives that doesn't fit the picture they'd assembled. Graham recovered quickly. "Qualifications don't authorize you to access restricted property." Nolan agreed. "They don't." "Then we're done here." Graham turned to Sloane. "Think the next step is clear." Sloane looked at Nolan. He looked back at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite get hold of, like he was standing slightly outside the situation, watching it happen, and had already made his peace with the outcome. "You're terminated," she said. "Effective immediately. HR will process your final payment. Security will escort you to collect your belongings." Nodded. Then Graham turned to the senior facilities technician and said, "His toolbox. Get it out of the bay." The technician picked it up and carried it across the floor. He set it down near the door. It was an old box, not the sleek rolling carts the engineers used. a worn metal case, dented at one corner, with latches that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. Kind of toolbox that had been somewhere. Graham walked past it, and in a gesture so fast it almost looked accidental, but wasn't he caught the side of it with his foot. It hit the floor and the latches gave. Tools scattered across the polished concrete. Wrenches, picks, a small caliper, a folded piece of grid paper covered in handwritten notes, a photo that landed face down. The room went very still. Sloane felt her stomach drop. She looked at Graham. His face was neutral. He didn't look down at the tools. Nolan crouched down. He picked up each tool without speaking. The wrench, the pick, the caliper. He folded the piece of grid paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Yes, he reached for the photo last, looked at it for just a second, not long enough for anyone else to see it, and tucked it away. He closed the latches, stood up, picked up the box. He didn't look at Graham. He didn't look at Sloane. He walked toward the door, and the engineer stood back to let him through, and nobody said a word. Car passed inspection the next morning. Graham's team ran a full diagnostic, announced the seals were within acceptable parameters, and signed off on the prototype for qualifying. Sloane signed the authorization because Graham signed it first, and because she was exhausted, and because the alternative pulling the car would cost them the entire qualifying window. She told herself she was being rational. She thought about Nolan Keats for the rest of the day. She thought about the way he'd described the seal failure. The specificity of it, 280 degrees, 12 minutes. The exact location on the fuel line junction wasn't a lucky guess. That wasn't something you looked up. That was someone who understood what they were looking at. She thought about his hands when he picked up his tools. They weren't the hands of a man who cleaned drains for a living. They were careful hands, practiced hands, the kind that knew what they were holding. Called Tessa Marlowe at 9 o'clock that evening. Tessa was 26, 2 years out of Georgia Tech, and the only engineer on the floor who asked questions nobody else thought to ask. She also had the useful quality of being someone who, when asked to do something quietly, actually kept it quiet. I need you to pull car 7 back into the secondary bay tonight, Sloane said. The main floor, the secondary bay. And I need you to look at the injector seals on cylinders 2 and 6, and the primary fuel line junction. There was a pause. Graham signed off this morning. He did. Another pause. You want me to check his check? I want you to look at 4 specific seals and tell me what you see. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, call you when I'm done. The call came at 12:48 in the morning. Sloane was still awake, sitting at the kitchen counter of her apartment with a cup of cold coffee and her father's old engineering's notes spread across the counter. She'd pulled them out for reasons she couldn't fully explain, just the restless feeling that she was missing something large. Her phone rang. She picked it up. All 4, Tessa said. Her voice was tight. All 4 seals are compromised. The junction seal on the fuel line is the worst. If this car runs at race temperatures, she stopped. Sloane, if this car runs at race temperatures for more than 10 or 12 minutes, we're going to have a catastrophic fuel system failure. Sloane put down her cup. How did Graham's team miss this? She said. They didn't test at temperature, Tessa said quietly. The stress fractures are microscopic at ambient. You can only see them under thermal conditions or with a specific kind of optical inspection equipment. She paused. If you already know exactly where to look. Sloane stared at her father's notes. His handwriting was careful and square. He'd always said you could tell everything about an engineer by how they wrote their numbers. Tessa, she said, don't touch anything. Don't move the car. Talk to anyone on the floor about this tonight. And pull the engineering archive for me. Everything under the original platform design. I want to know who built this engine. She already had a feeling she knew the answer. She just needed to see the name. The archive was 12 years old, stored on a legacy server that hadn't been accessed in over 2 years. When Tessa pulled the files at 1:30 in the morning and began forwarding them to Sloane's private account, there were hundreds of them, design drawings, to load calculations, thermal models, revision histories. On every original document in the author field, there was a name, Nolan Keats. Sloane sat at her kitchen counter and went through them one by one. The engine platform that had won Apex Dominion its first championship. Combustion system, that engineers across the industry had spent a decade trying to reverse engineer. The safety architecture that had been, until very recently, the reason drivers climbed into these cars with confidence. All of it, every line. N. Keats, she found the revision history next. The originals dated back 12 years. But starting about 5 years ago, someone had begun making changes. Small ones at first, then larger. A cooling channel narrowed here. A redundant system removed there. Weight reduction after weight reduction, each one signed off by G. Rourke. She kept scrolling, and then she found the document she wasn't expecting. It was a personnel record, old enough that it hadn't been migrated to the new HR system. It contained a performance review, a salary history, a termination letter. The name at the top was Nolan Keats. The title wasn't maintenance and general operations. It was chief design engineer. Sloane read the termination date. She read it again. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her kitchen. For a long moment, she thought about a maintenance worker in green coveralls, crouched under a car he had designed, trying to keep drivers alive. She thought about a toolbox hitting the floor. She thought about a man kneeling down to collect his tools without saying a single word. And for the first time in 4 days, Sloane Merrick felt something worse than fear. She felt ashamed. She found his personnel file at the bottom of the archive, a photo clipped to the front, the kind they took on your first day. He was younger in it, maybe 28, and he was smiling the way people smile when they don't know yet what's coming. There was a notes field at the bottom of the file, and someone had typed a single line in it, years after the original record was created. It said, "Do not rehire." The initials beside it were G. R. Sloane closed the laptop. She sat in her kitchen for a long time, listening to the building settle around her, and she thought about what her father used to say, that a company's character isn't revealed in how it treats the people at the top. It's revealed in how it treats the people nobody's watching. Picked up her phone. She found the number she'd pulled from the terminated employee records. She stared at it, and then she started figuring out what she was going to say. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. She'd half expected voicemail. It was past 2 in the morning, and she had no reasonable explanation for why she was calling a man she'd fired 16 hours earlier, a man whose toolbox she'd watched hit the floor and hadn't stopped. "Keats," he said. His voice was flat, not groggy. He'd been awake. Sets. Sloane had rehearsed something on the way to the phone. It had sounded reasonable in her head. Now, it dissolved completely, and she said, "I need to know if you're willing to talk." Pause. Not long, about the car, about a lot of things. He didn't answer right away. She could hear something in the background, faint, low, the sound a television makes when the volume is turned almost all the way down. She had the sudden, strange feeling that she'd interrupted something private, some version of his life she had no access to, and had never thought to wonder about. "Tonight," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Early, if that works." The facility. She hesitated. Somewhere neutral. Her pause. "There's a diner on Carmichael. Opens at 6. I'll be there at 6. He said, "Okay." He hung up. No pleasantries, no performance. Just okay. And then silence. She sat with the phone in her hand for a minute, looking at her father's notes, still spread across the counter. The old man had covered the margins with small calculations, tiny observations that had nothing to do with the main work the way he always thought, sideways and diagonal, catching things other people walked past. She'd spent 30 years watching him do it and had never quite figured out if it was genius or just a very particular kind of restlessness. She thought about N. Keats in the author field of every document in that archive, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed and did not sleep. The diner on Carmichael was the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for 25 years: laminate countertops, a pie case with 3 pies in it, booths with seats repaired with mismatched tape. The woman behind the counter had the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this long enough that she didn't need to think about any of it anymore. She poured coffee without being asked. Nolan was already there when Sloane arrived at 6. He had a mug in front of him and was looking out the window at the empty parking lot. He was wearing a gray Henley and jeans, which was jarring. Somehow she'd only ever seen him in the green coveralls. Without them, he looked less like a maintenance worker and more like someone who could be anything, which was maybe the point. He didn't stand when she came in. She didn't expect him to. She slid into the booth across from him, and the woman brought another mug and poured without comment and left them alone. "Thank you for coming," Sloane said. "You said you needed to talk." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I pulled the archive last night. The original platform design." She looked at him. All of it had your name on it. He didn't react. He just looked at her with those quiet, contained eyes and waited. "The engine in that car," she said. "The combustion system. Thermal architecture. The safety structures." She stopped. "You built all of it?" "Yes," he said. "Before last night, I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." She wasn't sure what she'd expected, anger maybe, or some kind of satisfaction at being acknowledged. What she got was neither. He just sat there, holding his coffee, and something about his composure made the whole thing feel worse, better. "I also found the revisions," she said, "starting about 5 years ago. The modifications to the cooling channels, the removal of the redundant cutoff system, the changes to the crash structure." She held his gaze. "Those all have Graham's name on them." Something shifted in his face then, not much, just a tightening around the eyes, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. He said quietly, "How long have you known?" He set the mug down. "I found out about 2 years ago. An engineer I used to work with, he'd stayed on after I left. He sent me some files." Nolan turned the mug slightly on the table, a small habitual movement. He was worried. He didn't want to go to management directly. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. "But you were." "Yes." Sloane leaned forward slightly. "So you came back." "As a maintenance worker." It was the easiest access level to get. Looks twice at the maintenance crew. He said it without bitterness, just stating a fact about how the world works. "I needed to inspect the cars, all of them. I needed to see in person what the modifications had actually done to the physical components, not just read about it on paper." "And what did you find?" He looked at her for a moment. "What Tessa found last night, more of it on more cars." The name landed and Sloane felt a small jolt. She hadn't mentioned Tessa to him. "I asked her to run the inspection after you were terminated," she said carefully. "I figured you would," he said. "You weren't convinced." "I could tell." He picked up the mug again. "You're harder to read than most people, but you weren't convinced." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment. She decided to let it go. "How many cars?" she said. He looked out the window again. Truck was pulling into the parking lot, idling near the entrance. "At least 9 that I've been able to check. Probably more. The modifications aren't identical across all of them. Some are worse than others. They all share the same core problem." He paused. "The safety margins that were built into the original design have been systematically removed. All at once, that would be obvious. A little at a time, over years, each change small enough to survive an individual review." "To save weight," she said. "To save weight," he confirmed. "Every kilo you remove from a race car is 1/10 of a second per lap, roughly. Over a season, that's the difference between a championship and a runner-up." He stopped. "Cars are faster now than they've ever been. The lap times are extraordinary. Meaningless less safe than the day infinitely less struck. Then they left my drafting table." The woman came back with a coffee pot and topped them both off. Neither of them spoke until she'd gone. "Nolan," Sloane said. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and it felt strange coming out, like stepping onto ice and not knowing yet if it would hold. "Why didn't you just go to the racing commission? Or the press?" "You had enough to." "Because I needed to be sure," he said. "Paper records can be altered." "They were already altered. My name was removed from the original designs. Did you know that?" "The versions on the main server. Graham's name is on all of them. The only intact originals are on the legacy archive, which nobody's accessed in years." He looked at her steadily. "And because if I went public with incomplete evidence, Graham would bury it. He's been at this company for 14 years. He has relationships. He has credibility. A beat. I had a maintenance badge and a history of abandoning my career." There was something in that last sentence that sat differently from the rest. Sloane heard it. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Kind of quiet. That means a person is deciding whether to answer the real question or a safer version of it." "Wife was sick," he said. "She'd been for about 18 months. It was." He started again. "It was a long illness. Difficult at the end." Sloane waited. "The night she died, I was at a meeting," he said. He said it with no particular inflection, The way you say things you've said to yourself so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth, rubbed down to just the shape of the words. A mandatory engineering review. We were 3 weeks from a major race. Graham called it, and I stayed because he stopped again. Turned the mug on the table, because I thought I had more time. The doctors had said she was stable. I stayed for 2 hours, and when I got to the hospital, she was already gone. The diner was very quiet. Outside, the truck that had been idling pulled out of the lot. "I'm sorry," Sloane said. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But it was true, and sometimes true has to do the work that adequate can't. Maisie was 4, he said, almost 5. A small change in his voice, barely perceptible, but there. The first real one she'd heard from him. I had this very clear thought, driving home from the hospital that night. Clear like I hadn't had in years. I thought, everything I build goes away. Cars get retired, designs get replaced, records get broken. But she's here right now, and right now is all I actually have. He picked up the coffee, took a sip, set it down. So I left. I took a job that let me be home every evening. I decided that was enough. Sloane thought about the photo that had fallen from his toolbox, the one he'd looked at before putting it away. She had not seen it, but she thought she understood now what it was. "She's 7 now?" Sloane said. She'd done the rough math. 7 in March. The barest trace of something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "She's not impressed by race cars." "Smart kid," Sloane said. That almost got a real smile. Almost. They sat there for a moment with their coffee and the quiet of the early morning and the particular weight of everything that had been said, and Sloane tried to order her thoughts into something useful. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to understand that I'm not asking to put you in a position. I'm asking because I don't know what to do, and you're the only person I trust right now who actually understands what we're dealing with." He looked at her steadily. "Okay, if I pull the cars all 9 or however many are compromised, I need to do it in a way that Graham can't spin. If he gets ahead of the story, if he positions this as a precautionary measure that he ordered, everything gets buried again and nobody is accountable." She paused. "But if I move too fast, I tip him off, and he destroys whatever evidence is left." Was quiet for a moment. "The physical cars can't be altered," he said. "That's the thing he hasn't accounted for. You can delete a file. You can overwrite a record. But if you measure the crash structure on Mateo Cruz's car, and it's 4 millimeters thinner than spec, that's not an opinion. That's a fact." He looked at her. "Who knows you called me last night?" "Buddy, I used my personal phone. And Tessa?" "I called her directly. She reported to me, not Graham, when she was first hired. Complicated internal structure. But essentially, yes. She's mine." He nodded slowly. "Then here's what I think you do." He laid it out methodically. Without drama, pull each car to the secondary bay one at a time under a routine maintenance rotation, so it doesn't read as a coordinated action. Have Tessa run thermal inspections and document everything on an independent recording system, not the company network. Pull Nolan's original blueprints from the legacy archive and move hard copies off-site immediately, before anyone notices they've been accessed. Yes, he'd intervened. Get an independent inspector, someone with no Apex-Dominion relationship, to verify the physical measurements on the most critical components. If you do all that before Graham realizes what you're doing, instead, you'll have physical evidence that can't be disputed, documentation with a clear chain of custody, and his name on every modification. He paused. And you'll need to be the one who brings it to the Racing Commission. Through a lawyer, not through PR. You personally. Be ugly, she said. Yes, it could cost us the season. Yes, she looked at him. You understand that I'm the one who fired you. I'm aware, he said, and you're still sitting here telling me how to do this. He looked back at her with that quiet, glass-behind-the-eyes expression. I'm not doing it for you, he said. It wasn't harsh, just honest, in the blunt way of someone who's been through enough to stop softening things unnecessarily. Mateo Cruz is 23 years old. He's starting his 3rd season. He's good, really good. The kind of good that only comes around every 10 years or so. And in about 70 hours, he's going to climb into a car that I designed and that someone has been quietly taking apart for years. He stopped. I'm not going to let that happen because I'm angry about a toolbox. Sloane didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I need you to come back. He shook his head. I was terminated. I'm unterminating you. That's not a word. I run the company. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the sky was going from gray to pale gold, the particular color of early morning in a city that was just starting to remember itself. Can't come back as an engineer, he said. Not officially. Yet. If Graham sees my name on an access log or a personnel record, we lose the element of surprise. He thought for a moment. Maintenance workers are invisible. Nobody looks at them. She heard something in that sentence that made her not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right. And she'd been part of the reason it was true. Maintenance workers have facility access to every bay, he continued, including the secondary bay, after hours. And maintenance logs don't show up on Graham's daily reports. You'd go back in the coveralls, she said, for now. She nodded slowly. There's one more thing. Archive the original documents with your name. Graham must have known about them. He just didn't think anyone would look. He thought I was gone, Nolan said, and he thought the legacy server was as good as dead. He picked up the last of his coffee. People get comfortable when they think they've won. Sloane paid for the coffee. Nolan didn't argue about it. Yes, he'd intervened. They walked out into the early morning together, and in the parking lot they stood for a moment with the cool air and the light that was still deciding what it wanted to be. One question, she said. He waited. The photo. In your toolbox, when it fell, she stopped. I didn't see it. I'm not asking what it was. She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. He was quiet for a second. It's a picture of Maisie, he said, from her first day of kindergarten. She was wearing this backpack that was almost as big as she was. She had one sock higher than the other because she'd put them on herself and she wouldn't let me fix it. A pause. I've had it in the toolbox since I started the maintenance job, to remember why I was doing it. Sloane nodded. She looked down at the pavement for a moment. I should have picked up the tools, she said, when they fell. I should have helped you pick them up. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not forgiveness exactly, because he wasn't the performing kind, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested the accounting wasn't finished, but that it could eventually come out in the right place. Come back, she said again, please. He looked at the building down the road, Apex Dominion's main facility, its roofline just visible above the commercial strip, the logo lit in the early morning. He looked at it for long enough that she thought he might say no. Then he said, I'll need facility access restored by 8. I'll call security when I get to the car. And I'll need the secondary bay reserved for the next 5 nights. He picked up his keys from his jacket pocket. Tell Tessa I'll meet her there at 7:30 tonight. He turned and walked to his truck, an older model, nothing flashy, with a small sticker in the rear window that she couldn't quite read from where she stood. He didn't look back. He just got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot with the unhurried steadiness of a man who'd already decided what he was going to do. Sloane stood in the parking lot for a moment after he left. She thought about her father, about the way he used to say that the most dangerous thing in any company wasn't incompetence. It was a capable person who stopped being watched. Graham Rourke. She thought, sitting in his office right now, with his coffee and his certainty, believing that the story was already written and that he knew how it ended. She thought about a 7-year-old girl with one sock higher than the other, and a father who'd built an empire in the margins of his grief, and decided that being home for dinner was worth more than having his name on a wall. She got in her car. She called security, and she started making the calls that would, over the next several days, either save everything or burn it completely down. And she found, to her own surprise, that she was more afraid of the first outcome than the second, because saving everything the wrong way meant that nothing actually changed. And something, she was beginning to understand, had to change. She had her fear's notes in her bag, folded, the margins full of his sideways thinking, brought them without quite knowing why. Now, stopped at a red light, 3 blocks from the facility, she understood. He'd always said the same thing when she asked him how he knew who to trust. He'd said, watch how a person handles the moment when it costs them something, when there's nothing in it for them, when the smart play is to walk away and they don't. She thought about a man in green coveralls, crouched under a car he'd designed, trying to keep a 23-year-old driver alive. Credit, for no money, for nothing except the fact that he'd built something and couldn't stand to watch it be turned into a weapon. The light turned green. She drove. Tessa Marlowe had not slept. She'd tried around 3 in the morning, lying on the narrow couch in her apartment with her shoes still on and her phone face up on her chest in case Sloane called back. She'd stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes, running numbers in her head, not equations exactly, like the ghost of them, but the shape of what she'd seen under Car 7's chassis, replaying on a loop she couldn't switch off. By 4:30, she gave up and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the inspection notes she'd in the secondary bay. No, reading them back like they might say something different the second time. They didn't. All 4 seals, everyone Nolan Keats had named, standing in the main bay with his toolbox in his hand and the whole engineering department watching him like he was something that had wandered in from outside. She'd been in that crowd. She'd watched him get fired. She'd watched the toolbox hit the floor, and she'd watched him kneel down, and she had not moved from where she was standing. Not even when every reasonable instinct she had was telling her that something was badly wrong with what was happening. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She arrived at the facility at 6:45, well before Graham's usual 8 o'clock. The main floor was quiet, a skeleton crew running basic overnight checks, a security guard doing his round near the east entrance. She signed in with her regular badge and went straight to her office and pulled up the archive access log from the previous night. Sloane's private credentials had accessed the legacy server at 1:18 Set imp fiend. Tessa looked at the files that had been opened and felt the pieces settle into a picture she'd been half assembling since the night before. He said Zienzi. If Sloane had found what Tessa thought she'd found, then this morning was going to be one of those mornings that divided things into before and after. 7:15, her office phone rang. "I need you to do something for me," Sloane said without preamble. "And I need you to do it without putting anything on the company network." Tessa pulled a legal pad from her desk drawer. "Okay. Secondary bay, 7:30, a pause. You're going to be working with someone." Another pause, shorter but deliberate. "Nolan Keats." Tessa put down her pen. He's not a maintenance worker," Sloane said. "He's the engineer who designed the platform in those cars. Credentials are MIT, master's degree, thermodynamics and combustion systems. He was chief design engineer at this company for 6 years before Graham removed his name from everything and pushed him out. A beat. I need you to treat him accordingly." Tessa stared at the legal pad. "Graham removed his. I'll explain everything tonight. Right now I need you to pull the inspection equipment from the secondary storage locker, the thermal imaging unit, and the optical measurement array, not the standard kit. Sign them out under routine calibration maintenance. Put my name on anything." "Understood." And Tessa. Sloane's voice went quieter. "Talk to Graham today. If he asks you anything about the cars, tell him you're running standard post-diagnostic checks. Nothing more." After she hung up, Tessa sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone. She thought about Graham Rourke, the way he ran a meeting, the way he could fill a room just by walking into it, the particular quality of his confidence that had always read to her as competence, and now, this morning, was beginning to read as something else entirely. She thought about the fact that she had a master's degree from Georgia Tech and 3 years of experience, and she had never once questioned the revision history on those designs. Never once pulled the original documents and compared them against the current specs. She thought about Nolan Keats on his knees on the garage floor, picking up his tools. She pulled the legal pad back toward her and started making a list. By 7:30 that evening, she had the secondary bay prepped. The thermal imaging unit was set up on its tripod near Car 7's engine bay. The optical measurement array, a precise instrument usually reserved for crash structure verification, sat on a rolling cart beside it. The bay doors were closed. The overhead lights were dimmed, except for the work area. The security camera nearest the secondary entrance had developed, quietly and coincidentally, a minor technical fault that Tessa had reported to facilities that afternoon. She heard the side door at 7:28. Keats came in the way he'd always come in, she realized quietly. Without announcement, in the green coveralls, carrying a worn metal case that she now understood held things considerably more specialized than standard maintenance tools. He looked around the bay, assessed the setup, and gave a small nod. "Good placement on the thermal unit," he said. We'll want the ambient temperature in here stable for at least 20 minutes before we run it. Did you let the equipment warm up? 25 minutes, she said. He looked at her, then a direct, evaluating look, not unkind. You're Tessa, yes. Sloane said you found all 4 seals last night. First pass, yes. I documented them, but I didn't remove anything. Wanted to preserve the state. Something shifted in his expression approval. Maybe, though he didn't perform it. That was the right call. He set the metal case on the workbench and opened it. Tools inside were arranged with the particular precision of someone who had a specific use for each one and knew exactly where it lived. I'm going to walk you through what I'm looking for. I need a second set of eyes, and I need someone who can testify to what they saw independently. You understand what I mean by that? You mean this might end up in front of an investigator, she said, or a racing commission panel, or a courtroom. He pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, possibly all 3. She nodded. She pulled on her own gloves. Then let's start. They worked through the first 2 hours methodically. The way you work when the stakes are high enough that speed becomes secondary to accuracy. Moved around the car with kind of authority that had nothing to do with his coveralls, the authority of a person in the presence of something they understand completely. Yes, he'd intervened, the way a surgeon's hands change when they reach the part of the procedure they've done 1,000 times. He talked as he worked, not explaining for her benefit, but thinking out loud, the way engineers do when they're in the territory of something that matters. Cooling channel modification is here, he said, angling the flashlight into the engine bay. You see the housing on the secondary loop? The original spec was 42 millimeters interior diameter. Run the calipers, she measured. 37.4. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the reading on the calipers, and then looked back at the housing. Nearly 5 millimeters, he said quietly. That's not a tolerance adjustment. That's not a state-saving compromise. 5 millimeters out of a 42 millimeter cooling channel is a 12% reduction in coolant flow under sustained temperature. He paused. At high engine loads, over 15 minutes of operation, the thermal margin disappears. And then what happens? The seals fail first. After that, depending on which seal, you get fuel contamination, coolant loss, or both. Either way, the engine comes apart. He said it without drama, the way a doctor describes a prognosis to a colleague plainly, because plain is more useful than softened. If it happens at speed, the driver has very little time and very little margin. Tessa wrote the measurement in her notebook, the paper notebook, not the tablet, because paper couldn't be remotely accessed or wiped from a server somewhere. They moved to the crash structure at 10:15. This was where Harvey Bell came in. Harvey was 63 years old and had been a security guard at Apex Dominion for 11 years, which meant he'd been there when Nolan was still chief design engineer. Though the two had barely overlapped, Nolan left early in Harvey's tenure. He was a large man, soft-spoken, with reading glasses he kept on a chain around his neck, and a habit of observing things carefully before he said anything about them. He'd worked nights long enough that most of the engineering staff had stopped noticing him, which made him, as Nolan had noted to Sloane that morning, useful in ways nobody had thought to use him. Sloane had briefed Harvey that afternoon in the parking lot of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the facility. She'd told him what they needed: a credible witness, independent of the engineering department, who could verify that a specific inspection had occurred on a specific night without being instructed what to find. Harvey had listened to all of it, asked 2 questions, and said yes. He arrived at the secondary bay at 10 o'clock, signed in on a standard security round, and when Tessa let him in through the side door, he stood at the edge of the work area with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched. "Mr. Keats," he said, when Nolan looked up. Nolan looked at him for a moment. "Harvey, been a while." "It has." Harvey pulled out the small video recorder Sloane had given him, not a phone, a dedicated unit that wrote to its own internal storage and couldn't be remotely accessed. "I'm told I need to record what I see here, without being told what I'm supposed to see." "That's right," Nolan said. "I'm going to measure the crash structure on this car against the original specification." "Yes, I'm going to tell you what the specification is before I measure, and then we're all going to see what the measurement says." Harvey turned on the recorder. "Ready." Read from the original blueprint, a printed copy. A screen, folded to the relevant section, with his own handwritten annotations in the margins from 12 years ago. He read it aloud, clearly, with the recorder running. The crash structure specification for the lateral impact zone, driver's side, composite thickness, the layering sequence, the minimum measurement at the critical stress point behind the driver's shoulder. Original specification, he said, is 68 millimeters composite depth at the primary stress point. That measurement was not arbitrary. It was calculated to absorb a lateral impact at race speeds while maintaining the survival cell. He looked at Harvey, then at Tessa. Both of you hear that number? 68, Tessa said. Harvey nodded. 68. Nolan positioned the measurement array at the designated point on the car's chassis. He made the adjustment slowly, set the contact points, read the display, and then stepped back. He didn't say anything for a moment. Tessa leaned forward and read the display herself. She wrote it in the notebook. Then she looked up at Nolan. 51.3, she said. The number sat in the air of the secondary bay, like something physical. 51.3 millimeters, where 68 had been designed, calculated, and built. Nearly 17 millimeters missing from the structure that was supposed to keep a 23-year-old driver alive. If the car hit a wall at 190 miles per hour, Harvey said nothing. He kept the recorder pointed at the measurement display, said the date, time, and present parties for the recording. Harvey did. Then Nolan straightened up and pulled off one glove and stood beside the car for a moment. Yo! He put his hand on the roof of the chassis, not the way you'd touch a machine, but the way you'd put your hand on the shoulder of something you recognized, something that had once been yours and had been hurt while you weren't looking. Tessa watched him and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say. We need to do all 9, Nolan said, putting the glove back on. Tonight if we can. I want complete documentation before morning. That's 7 more cars, Tessa said. I know. He picked up the measurement array. Let's get the next one in here. They worked until 4 in the morning. Harvey ran 2 more official security rounds during that time, so his movement stayed consistent with his usual pattern. Tessa documented everything in the paper notebook, cross-referencing each measurement against the original specifications in Nolan's blueprint copies. Moved through each car with the same methodical care, the same running commentary, the same absolute refusal to rush anything. By the time they finished the 9th car, they had documented 17 separate deviations from original specification across the fleet. 6 were in cooling systems, 4 were in fuel management components, 7 were in crash structures. Every single car was compromised in at least 2 ways. 3 cars, including Mateo's, had crash structure measurements more than 15% below specification. Tessa sat on the floor of the secondary bay at 4:12 in the morning, with her back against the workbench and her notebook in her lap, looking at the summary she'd written on the last page. She felt the particular kind of tired that lives past exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've been holding something frightening at arm's length for hours and you've just set it down. She said, not a question. Nolan was across the bay, packing the measurement array back into its case. Every one of these modifications was signed off by him. Every weight reduction, every specification change. She turned back through the notebook pages. Some of these have 3 separate revision approvals. He looked at them 3 times. She paused. How do you sign off 3 times on a crash structure that's 17 millimeters below spec? You sign off on it because you've calculated that the probability of a specific kind of impact, at a specific angle, at a specific speed, is low enough that the performance gain is worth the risk. Closed the case and latched it. And because no one has held you accountable yet, so the risk has always been theoretical. Tessa looked at him. Until it isn't. Until it isn't, he said. Harvey was standing near the door, recorder in his jacket pocket, his big hands folded in front of him. He'd been quiet for most of the night, which was the right call. A witness who stays out of the work is more credible than one who participates in it. But now he said, what happens next? Nolan looked at Sloane's empty space in the bay. She'd been there for the first 2 cars and then left to make calls she hadn't explained. That's Sloane's decision, he said. As if on cue, the side door opened and Sloane came in. She looked like she hadn't slept either, which meant the 3 of them were operating on a combined 0 hours of rest, which was probably not the ideal condition for decisions of this magnitude. But there wasn't a better option available. She looked at Tessa's face first, then Nolan's. All 9? All 9, Tessa said. Sloane sat down on the workbench. Gracefully, she just sat, the way you sit, when the effort of standing isn't worth it anymore. She had her phone in one hand and what looked like a printed email in the other. I've been on the phone with our legal team for the last 2 hours, she said, and with the head of the Racing Commission's safety division. Off the record, Nolan said, not quite a question. For now, they need to know enough to prepare, but they can't open a formal investigation until I give them documented evidence through official channels. She looked at the notebook in Tessa's lap. How complete is that? Complete enough, Tessa said. Measurements, dates, times, present, parties, cross-referenced against original spec. Harvey's video runs the whole night. Sloane looked at Harvey. Thank you. Harvey shrugged in the understated way of a man who doesn't consider doing the right thing to be noteworthy. Seemed like the right thing, he said, which confirmed it. Sloane looked back at Nolan. Graham is going to find out. Maybe not today, but soon. The moment I start pulling cars from the rotation, he'll know something is happening, Nolan said. And when he does, he's going to try to get ahead of it. She looked at the printed email in her hand. I've been thinking about what his play is. He can't deny the modifications. They're in the system under his name. He has to reframe them, make them look like standard engineering decisions, well within acceptable parameters. Maybe argue that the original specs were overly conservative. She paused. Or he finds someone else to blame. The bay was quiet for a moment. Nolan said. Sloane looked at him. You're the only other engineer whose name is associated with this platform, even if he had to erase it himself to make it work. She set the email down. His argument would be that the modifications were made to correct errors in your original design, that you built something defective and he was trying to fix it. That's why the original blueprints matter, Tessa said. If we have the originals with his name, we have them, Sloane said. I moved copies off-site last night. 3 sets, different locations. She looked at Nolan. You should know what you're walking into. If this goes public, his first move is going to be pointing at you. And you were gone for 4 years. You came back under a false employment category. You accessed restricted vehicles without authorization. She let that sit. A good lawyer could make that look bad. Nolan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cars lined up along the bay wall, 9 of them, each one documented now, each one carrying the physical record of what had been done to them. He thought about something he didn't say out loud, and whatever it was, it moved behind his eyes for a second and then settled. I built those cars to keep people alive, he said. If Graham wants to stand in front of a racing commission and explain why a 23-year-old kid's crash structure is 17 millimeters below spec, he can try. He picked up his metal case. Car doesn't lie. That's the thing about physical evidence. You can say whatever you want. The car just sits there and tells the truth. Sloane nodded. She looked at the 9 cars. She thought about Mateo Cruz, who she'd met twice, once at his signing and once at a preseason media event. He was the kind of young that made her feel old, not because of age, but because of the particular brightness of someone who hasn't had the brightness knocked out of them yet. He had a younger sister. He sent his parents money every month. She'd read it in a profile somewhere. He wore a wristband on his left arm that he never took off, and when a journalist asked him about it once, he said it was private, and the journalist had the decency not to push. He had 68 hours before he was scheduled to climb into a car with 51 millimeters of protection, where 68 should have been. I'm pulling all 9 cars tomorrow morning, Sloane said. I'm calling it a precautionary safety review. No other explanation until I'm ready to give one. She looked around the bay. I need all of you to be prepared for what happens after that. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a moment at whatever was on the screen, some draft or note or list of calls still to make, and then she put it in her pocket. She looked at the cars one more time. The flat fluorescent light of the secondary bay at 4 in the morning, they looked like what they were, machines built by one person, modified by another, now sitting quietly in the space between what they'd been designed to do and what they'd actually been turned into. Couldn't speak. They couldn't argue. They could only be measured. And the measurements didn't care about anyone's version of events. Was right about that. The car just sat there and told the truth. Tessa closed her notebook, capped her pen, and stood up from the floor. Every muscle in her lower back protested. She ignored them. She tucked the notebook inside her jacket, against her ribs, the way you carry something you're not willing to risk losing. Harvey turned off the lights nearest the door, and the four of them filed out of the secondary bay into the early morning dark, carrying between them everything they needed and knowing, without saying it, by the end of the next day, nothing up the Apex Dominion Racing Company was going to look the same as it had 48 hours ago. What none of them said, walking to their cars in the empty lot, was that Graham Rourke had arrived at the facility at 6:30 that same evening, 2 hours before they'd started, and had spent 40 minutes in his office before leaving again. The legacy server, which Sloane had accessed the previous night, had logged a second access at 9 p. Someone had opened the archive, and then at 9:14, 18 of the original design files had been flagged for deletion. The deletion had failed because Sloane had quietly changed the archive permissions at 2A, but the attempt had been logged, and the timestamp on that log 9p. That evening, with Graham Rourke's administrator credentials, was now sitting quietly in a server access record, waiting to be found by anyone who thought to look for it. Car wasn't the only thing that remembered everything. The machines always did. Graham Rourke found out about the car recall at 8:53 in the morning. He found out the way powerful intervened. He found out the way powerful people find out about things they weren't supposed to know yet through a subordinate who owed him a favor, and thought delivering bad news quickly was better than delivering it late. Call came from one of the senior mechanics on the main floor, a man named Dobbs, who had worked at Apex Dominion for 9 years, and had learned early that Graham Rourke was the kind of person worth keeping informed. All 9 cars, Dobbs said. She signed the order herself 40 minutes ago. Safety review, she's calling it. No timeline given. Graham was standing in his office with his jacket on, coffee in hand, about to head down to the engineering floor for the morning briefing. He stood very still while Dobbs talked. He didn't interrupt. He had the particular stillness of a man whose mind is moving very fast while his body does nothing at all. Who else knows? Said. Engineering staff got the notification 20 minutes ago. Fretting. Thank you, Graham said. He hung up. He set his coffee down on the desk. He picked it back up. He walked to the window that looked out over the main floor from up here. Through the glass, he could see the activity below already shifting, the floor crew moving cars toward the secondary bays, the engineers clustering in small groups the way people cluster when they've received news they don't understand yet. He thought about the archive access log. He'd checked it 2 nights ago, Sloane's credentials, 1:18 in the morning, 47 minutes of activity on the legacy server. He'd gone back in at 9 p.m. the following night to pull the files himself, and found the permissions had been changed. He'd known then that the situation was moving faster than he'd anticipated. The question was how much she had, and who she'd talked to, and how far it had already gone. Put on his jacket properly, checked his reflection in the small mirror beside the bookcase, a habit so old he didn't notice it anymore, and went downstairs. Sloane was in the main bay when he found her, standing with a clipboard and talking to the facility's supervisor. She was wearing a dark blazer, and she had the slightly hollowed look of someone who'd been awake too long, but her posture was straight and her voice was even, and she was moving through the morning with a kind of deliberate calm that Graham recognized as the managed version of something else. Graham, she said when she saw him, not surprised. She'd known he'd come. I just heard about the recall, he said. He kept his voice at the same register, concerned, collegial, the tone of a senior partner checking in on a decision he hadn't been consulted about. I'd have appreciated a conversation before this went to the floor. I made the decision last night, she said. You were at home. You have my number. I do, she said. She looked at him directly. Performance in it. Just a steady, level look that he found, if he was honest with himself, slightly more difficult to read than usual. I'll brief you fully when the inspection team arrives this afternoon. In the meantime, the cars stay in. She turned back to the facility supervisor. Yes, Graham stood there for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to register that she'd just entered the conversation, and then he turned and walked back toward the engineering floor with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality. He was thinking very quickly. She'd pulled 9 cars. That was not a routine precaution. You don't pull 9 cars without something specific driving it, which meant she'd found something, or someone had shown her something, and she'd moved on it before telling him, which meant she didn't trust him, which meant she either suspected or already knew. Thought about Tessa Marlowe, young Georgia Tech, reported nominally to Sloane, rather than to him a structural oddity he'd never bothered to correct, because Tessa had always been more interested in engineering problems than in organizational politics, which made her useful and unobtrusive. He thought about the secondary bay and the equipment sign-out log, which he'd pulled up on his phone while walking downstairs, and which showed a thermal imaging unit and an optical measurement array checked out under Tessa's name the previous afternoon. Returned that morning at 4:51. 4:51 in the morning. He stopped walking in the middle of the engineering floor and stood there for a moment, and several engineers noticed and found reasons to look somewhere else. Because 14 years of watching Graham Rourke operate had taught most of them that when he stood still like that in the middle of a room, it was better not to be the nearest person. No. He started walking again toward his office, and he pulled out his phone and made a call. The man who answered was a lawyer named Callum Brest, whom Graham had retained privately, if not through the company, for exactly this category of situation. Callum was expensive and efficient, and had the useful quality of being able to give direct answers without a lengthy preamble of qualifications. "I need to talk through something," Graham said, closing his office door behind him. "Tell me," Callum said. Graham told him. The broad strokes, the recall, the archive access, the equipment sign out, timeline, the pup. He did not tell him everything. He told him enough. Callum was quiet for a moment. "The core question is what they can prove, and through what chain," he said. "If the physical measurements are documented and witnessed, that's difficult terrain. Attribution question is where there's room to work. She has the original files," Graham said, "on the legacy server. My name is on the revisions. Your name is on engineering revisions that you signed as engineering director," Callum said. "That's your job. The question is whether those revisions can be characterized as negligent or intentional, and who made the original recommendation." A pause. "Is there any documentation that could suggest the recommendations came from elsewhere?" Graham looked out his window at the floor below. He thought about Nolan Keats, about a maintenance worker in green coveralls who had somehow gotten under Car 7 and had known exactly what to look for. He thought about the fired employee record and the note he'd added himself, "Do not rehire," and the fact that the man had apparently come back anyway, in a different role, and had been inside the building for 3 years. 3 years. He thought about what Nolan might have accessed in 3 years, what he might have documented. What a man who designed the original engine would be able to see just by looking at the cars he cleaned around. "There may be an option," Graham said. "The original design engineer, the man who created the platform. He left the company 8 years ago under difficult circumstances. He's been largely absent from the industry since then." He paused. "He made unauthorized modifications to Car 7 2 days ago. He was terminated for it." A long pause on Callum's end. "What kind of modifications?" "He claimed he was fixing a seal failure," Graham said. "He opened a restricted prototype without authorization. He had access to the engine bay, and he has a documented history of." He stopped. Reframed. His departure from the company was contentious. There were performance issues near the end of his tenure. His personal life was in significant disorder. Callum was quiet again. Graham could hear him thinking the particular quality of a lawyer's silence, which is never actually silence, but just thinking with the volume turned down. If a terminated employee with a contentious history made unauthorized access to the vehicles in question, Callum said slowly, "The modifications and to those vehicles can be shown to have originated from his design recommendations or his direct interference. He was in the building for 3 years as a maintenance worker," Graham said. "He had unsupervised access to all the bays." "That's a narrative," Callum said. "It's not nothing. I need it to be more than not nothing." Then you need to move quickly, Callum said, before she submits documentation to any external body. Once it's in front of the commission, the narrative is theirs, not yours. Graham hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment. He thought about 14 years, what he'd built at Apex Dominion, not just the wins, not just the lap times, but the entire architecture of the company's identity. The engineering philosophy, the technical reputation, relationships with sponsors, with race officials, with the press. All of it assembled piece by piece over a decade and a half, and underneath it, it's foundational to all of it, in ways nobody had ever been allowed to see clearly, was the work of a man he'd systematically erased, because the alternative was explaining why the company's breakthrough technology had been created by someone Graham hadn't discovered, hadn't developed, and couldn't control. He told himself in the early years that it was just pragmatic, that Nolan had abandoned the company, that his name on the original designs was a historical technicality rather than an ongoing claim, that someone had to carry the work forward, and Graham had carried it, and that was a form of ownership too. He'd stopped telling himself any version of the story, about 4 years ago. By then it wasn't a narrative he needed, it was just a fact he'd arranged. And facts you've arranged stop needing justification after a while. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the engineering department's personnel directory. He pulled up the archive revision logs, not the legacy server, the current one, and began going through the documented change history on the platform designs. He was looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that could be read ambiguously, anything he could use. He worked for 2 hours. At 11:45, his door opened without a knock. He looked up. Sloane was standing in the doorway. Behind her, slightly to one side, was a woman he didn't know, mid-40s, gray suit, kind of face that gave nothing away. And behind her was a man from the Racing Commission's technical office, whose name Graham knew and whose presence in his building without prior notification was something that had never happened before. "We're ready to begin the formal inspection briefing," Sloane said. "Conference room A. The Commission's safety liaison is joining us." She nodded toward the woman in the gray suit. "This is Dr. Reyes, independent technical investigator." Graham stood up. He kept his face neutral. He picked up his notebook from the desk and his pen, and he walked toward the door. As he passed Sloane, he said, quietly, so only she heard it, "I'd like to know who requested an independent investigator." "I did," she said, equally quiet. "Yesterday evening." He looked at her. She looked back. And in that second brief, the length of a breath, he understood that the situation was further along than he'd estimated, and that the ground he thought was solid was not, in fact, solid. He went down the hall to conference room A. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Dr. Race was methodical and thorough in the manner of someone who has done this exact thing before, and has learned to let the documents do most of the talking. Inspection record. She went through the inspection records. She went through the revision history. She asked Graham, tone of professional neutrality that somehow felt more pointed than any accusation, to explain the rationale behind 6 specific design modifications, referencing each one by document number and date. Graham answered carefully. He used the language of engineering compromise weight optimization, performance calibration, acceptable tolerance adjustment. He attributed several of the decisions to team recommendations, to collective engineering judgment, to the kind of iterative refinement that was normal in competitive motorsport. Dr. Reyes wrote things down and didn't comment on what she wrote. Commission liaison asked about the legacy archive. Graham said he hadn't accessed it recently. The liaison looked at a sheet of paper in front of him. IT security team has pulled the access log at Ms. Merrick's request, he said. It shows an access from your administrator credentials at 9 p. 2 nights ago. 18 files were flagged for deletion. The deletion failed because the permissions had already been changed. He looked up. Can you explain that access? There was a pause, a real one, not a thinking pause, the kind of pause that happens when a prepared answer runs out and there isn't another one immediately behind it. I was reviewing old documentation, Graham said. Routine. 9 p.m., the liaison said. I worked late, Doctor. Reyes wrote something down. Sloane, sitting at the end of the table, said nothing. She had said almost nothing for the past 3 hours. She'd let the documents speak and the questions land, and she'd sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, with the patience of someone who has already decided that this particular conversation has only one outcome and that rushing it would only muddy it. Graham looked at her across the table. She looked back at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a kind of settled certainty. The look of someone who's found the bottom of something and knows it's the bottom. The meeting ended at 3 in the afternoon without a resolution. That wasn't what this meeting was for. It was a documentation meeting, a record-establishing meeting, the kind of meeting that exists so that what came next had a proper foundation. Graham walked back to his office and closed the door and stood at the window for a long time. Thought about making more calls. He thought about Callum and the narrative and the maintenance worker with the toolbox. He thought about how a story works, how if you get it out first, at sufficient volume, with sufficient authority. The second version always sounds like a rebuttal, even when it's the truth. Thought about Nolan Keats on his knees on the garage floor. He thought about how easy it had been that morning to arrange for the toolbox to fall, how natural the gesture had felt, how much of the cruelty in his life had felt natural after long enough. He sat down at his desk. He picked up his phone and put it down and picked it up again. And then he did what cornered people do when they've run out of better options. He called a journalist, a specific one, a motorsport reporter named Dex Lafferty, who'd written favorably about Apex Dominion 3 times in the past 2 years, who owed Graham a small professional debt in the way journalists sometimes do, who had the reach and the platform to put a story into the air fast enough to shape the initial coverage before Sloane's version had time to solidify. Dex, the version he'd worked out in his head. He was careful with his language, nothing falsely specific, nothing that crossed into provable falsehood. He talked about an unauthorized access to the prototype, a terminated maintenance worker with a complicated history, the company's own safety review already underway under his leadership. He said Nolan's name once, with the particular cadence of a man mentioning a sad fact, and did not say it again. Dex asked questions. Graham answered some of them. After he hung up, he felt something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. Feeling of having moved, after a period of stillness, of having done something, instead of just watching things happen. What he didn't know, couldn't know, because Sloane hadn't told him, and hadn't told anyone who would tell him, was that at 6:30 that evening, main briefing room, on the executive floor, a different conversation was about to happen. Sloane had spent most of the afternoon on calls. She'd talked to the Racing Commission's safety director directly, not through a liaison for 45 minutes. She'd talked to the company's external legal counsel. She'd talked to the PR director, a woman named Sandra Osei, who had been with the company for 6 years, and who, when Sloane explained the situation in full, had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "You're planning to tell all of it." Publicly. "Yes," Sloane said. "That's going to be an ugly news cycle. Sponsors will ask questions." "I know." Her pause. "Okay," Sandra said. "Then let's do it right." At 6:15, Nolan's phone rang. He was at home. He'd been home since 2 in the afternoon when Sloane had told him to leave the facility and stay unreachable until she called. He'd picked up Maisie from school at 3. He'd made dinner. He was sitting at the kitchen table helping her with a worksheet. About fractions she had strong opinions, mostly negative ones, when his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. Sloane. "Give me 5 minutes," he said to Maisie. She looked at the phone, at him, with the evaluating expression of a 7-year-old who has learned that when adults say 5 minutes, the negotiation has only just begun. "Are you going to go back to work tonight?" "I don't know yet." "You had dinner here." "I did." She considered this seriously, apparently weighing it against some internal accounting system he wasn't fully privy to. "Okay," she said, with the gravity of a concession. She walked. He'd intervened. Went back to the fractions. He walked to the back of the house and answered the phone. "Called Dex Lafferty," Sloane said without preamble. Knew the name. Motorsport reporter, good reach, had written a profile of Apex Dominion 2 years ago that had read like a press release, written by the company itself. What did he say? Dex's editor called Sandra 20 minutes ago for comment on a story about an unauthorized maintenance worker who tampered with the company's prototype vehicles. Story mentions you by name. She paused. It's going to run tomorrow morning unless we
Look.
give them something better tonight. Leaned against the hallway wall. He looked toward the kitchen, where he could hear Maisie humming something to herself, a tuneless habit she'd had since she was 4. What do you want to do? He said. I want to put you on the phone, she said. Speakerphone, in front of Dr. Reyes, the commission liaison, Sandra, and 2 reporters from the motorsport press, who I trust to be accurate. She stopped. It's your name, Nolan. I'm not going to make this decision for you. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Callum Brest Bizelbidon Graham, right now that the narrative was everything, that whoever spoke first controlled the frame. He thought about a story hitting the news tomorrow morning with his name in it and the word tampered and Dex Lafferty's byline, and how that story would travel before anything else had a chance to catch up with it. He thought about Mateo Cruz and a crash structure 17 millimeters below specification. What time, he said. 7 o'clock. He looked at his watch. 40 minutes. I'll be there, he said. He went back to the kitchen. Maisie had finished the fractions worksheet, or at least had stopped fighting with it, and was drawing something in the margin of her notebook, car. He saw, which surprised him, and then, on reflection, didn't. I have to go in tonight, he said, just for a couple hours. She looked up. Her expression was complicated in the way that 7-year-olds' expressions are when they're feeling something they don't have precise vocabulary for yet. Quite upset, not quite okay with it either. Is it important? She said. He thought about how to answer that, honestly, without loading the answer with things she didn't need to carry. There's a young driver, he said, 23 years old. He might be in danger if I don't help figure some things out tonight. She thought about this, with the seriousness she brought to most things. 23 is not that young, she said. No, he said. He's someone's kid. That landed. She looked at the notebook for a moment. Then she looked back up at him with an expression that was so much like Claire's, not physically, but in some quality of the attention, the steadiness of it, that he had to look slightly to the left for a second. Okay, she said, but you have to be back for the show at 9. Show, she named it. He had no idea what it was. 9 o'clock, he said. I'll be back. He called the neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, who had watched Maisie before and was reliable and unflappable and had the useful quality of never asking more questions than necessary. Then he grabbed his jacket and his medal case, which he'd brought home out of habit, and he went back out into the evening. He drove to the facility thinking about what he was going to say, which turned out to be not that complicated because the truth rarely is. The difficulty was never in the facts. The difficulty was in saying them in a room full of people who had been given a different version, and had been given it first. He arrived at 6:58. So, Sandra met him in the lobby and walked him up, giving him the kind of quick briefing that feels like it covers everything, and actually covers almost nothing, which is what you do when there's no time to do better. The briefing room was smaller than he'd expected. Dr. Reyes was there, and the commission liaison, and 2 reporters, a woman named Gail Park from a motorsport weekly that Nolan had read for years, and a man whose name he didn't catch, who had his recorder already on the table. Sandra sat near the door. Tessa was there, which he hadn't expected, sitting in the back corner with her notebook. Sloane was standing at the head of the table. She looked at him when he came in, a brief, direct look that communicated several things without words, the most important of which was, I'm with you on this, whatever happens. He sat down. Sloane put her phone on the table and hit the speakerphone. She said, I have Nolan Keats on with us. He is the original design engineer for the Apex Dominion racing platform. I want him to walk everyone through what he found and why it matters. Looked at the phone, then at the room. He thought about the moment a few days ago when he'd been on his knees on the garage floor, picking up tools while 40 people watched. He thought about what it had cost him to do that quietly, without erupting, without saying any of the things that had been sitting behind his teeth. He thought about Claire, and the meeting, and the hospital. Thought about Maisie drawing a car in the margin of her fractions worksheet. And he started talking. He was precise, he was calm. He used exact numbers measurements, dates, document references, the specific thermal threshold above which the seal failure occurred. He described the modifications to each of the 9 cars in enough detail that the reporters had to write fast. He referenced the original blueprints by document number and described where the copies were stored and how many sets existed and what chain of custody they'd been maintained under. He explained the deletion attempt on the legacy server and the timestamp and whose credentials had been used. When Gale Park asked him why he'd come back to the company as a maintenance worker instead of going directly to the commission, he said, "Because I needed to see the cars, read about them, see them. And because a man who left under difficult circumstances, coming forward with a 4-year-old grievance, I needed evidence that couldn't be argued away before I handed it to anyone." When the other reporter asked him about the unauthorized access to car 7, he said, "Yes. I opened that car without authorization. I replaced a seal that would have failed at race temperature. I was fired for it." He paused. "The seal was in exactly the condition I told Ms. Merrick it was in. The other 4 seals were in exactly the condition I described. If you want to discuss authorization, I'm willing to discuss it. But I'd suggest we discuss the crash structure measurements first." There was a moment in the room, not silent, but a different quality of attention, the kind that happens when people stop waiting for the narrative and start actually listening. Sin Saminte, Sloane watched Nolan from her end of the table. She watched him hold the room without performing for it, without managing it, without doing any of the things that people who are used to rooms do. He just told the truth at the speed of someone who knew exactly what it was and where each piece of it lived. She thought about her father's notes in her bag, about the margin calculations, the sideways thinking, the things he'd noticed that other people walked past. She thought about a founding wall with 2 names on it and a third one missing. She thought about what it was going to cost. All of this, in money and in reputation, and in the kind of public scrutiny that a company never fully recovers from. Completely, in the ways that don't show. He'd intervened. She thought about it and found that she was not afraid of it, which surprised her, because fear had been her default setting for as long as she could remember. The reporters asked their last questions at 8:42. Dr. Reyes Est confirmed that a formal inspection of all 9 vehicles would begin the following morning with the commission's full technical team. The Racing Commission liaison said on the record that the race in which Mateo Cruz was scheduled to compete was postponed pending safety review. Graham Rourke's story ran in Dex Lafferty's column the following morning. It ran alongside Gale Park's stories, which was longer and more detailed and had the original blueprint document numbers and the measurement data and a quote from an independent technical investigator. Graham's version did not hold up next to the measurements. Measurements don't care about narratives. They just sit there, accurate, waiting. Left the facility at 8:49. He was on the highway by 9:02, driving through the night toward the house where Maisie was watching whatever the 9 o'clock show was with Mrs. Aldridge, and the kitchen light was probably still on. Worse, dishes in the sink from dinner. The fractions worksheet was on the table still, with the car drawn in the margin. He was 12 minutes late. He pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for one moment in the quiet of the car with his hands on the wheel. Then he went inside. Mrs. Aldridge was asleep in the armchair when Nolan came through the front door. Deeply asleep, the television was still on, volume low, and she stirred the moment she heard the latch. She was 71 years old and had somewhat the light sleeping habits of someone who'd raised 4 children and never fully recovered the ability to go all the way under. She blinked at him, checked the clock on the wall, and said 12 minutes. He said, "I'm sorry." She held out until 9:45, Mrs. Aldridge said, working herself up from the chair with the careful movements of someone whose knees had opinions. Then she decided you weren't coming and went to bed on her own. She picked up her cardigan from the arm of the chair. She left the light on in the hallway. Nolan nodded. He handed Mrs. Aldridge her coat from the hook by the door, and she patted his arm once, the way older women do when they've decided a person is essentially decent and doesn't need to be told so directly, and she left. He stood in the quiet of the living room for a moment. Television murmured. The kitchen light was on, the way Mrs. Aldridge had said the hallway light, actually, a small night light, in the shape of something he couldn't quite make out from here. Yes, he'd a remnant from when Maisie had been afraid of the dark and then had decided at age 6 that she wasn't anymore, but had kept the light on anyway because, as she'd explained with complete seriousness, it helped her see if she needed water in the middle of the night. He turned off the television. He went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water over his hands for a moment, for any particular reason, just the sensation of it, the ordinary physical fact of water and temperature, and the solidity of the counter under his palms. On the kitchen table, the fractions worksheet was still there. Car she'd drawn in the margin had been elaborated since he'd left. It had a driver in it now, a small stick figure, with what appeared to be a helmet. Underneath the car she'd written, in the unsteady print of a 7-year-old working, without lines, "Go fast, stay safe," stood there and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall and looked in through her half-open door. She was on her side, facing the wall, one arm wrapped around the stuffed dog she'd had since she was 2 and still slept with, despite publicly denying it in all social contexts. Her breathing was the deep, uncomplicated breathing of a child who has no unresolved business with the day. He pulled her door to its usual position, not quite closed, not quite open, the exact angle she preferred, and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while and didn't sleep, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than it had been in recent days. Yes, he'd intervened, less like waiting for something bad, and more like sitting with something that hadn't finished settling yet. Kind of wakefulness that isn't distress, just the mind doing its slow accounting at the end of a long day. Thought about the briefing room, about Gail Park's recorder on the table, about the moment Sloane had put the phone on speaker and said his name and his title, his real title, not the one on the maintenance roster, and the quality of the silence that had followed in that room, particular silence, of people who were revising something. He thought about Graham Rourke and found to his own mild surprise that he wasn't thinking about him with anger. More with something like recognition, the recognition of a pattern he'd seen before in people who were competent enough to succeed and afraid enough to need more than success. Graham had built a real career. He was a real engineer. He'd kept the company running for 8 years after Nolan left, had won championships on a platform he had to Heisend, but had made decisions that were sometimes good and sometimes expedient, and had stopped being able to tell the difference at some point that probably felt, from the inside, entirely gradual. Knew something about decisions that felt gradual from the inside. He knew about the meeting he'd stayed for. About 2 hours that had seemed, in the moment, to be a necessary professional obligation and had turned out to be the thing he thought about every day for the rest of his life. The difference between him and Graham, he thought, was not that he was a better person. It was that his mistake had been paid for immediately, in full, in the worst possible currency, and Graham's had been accumulating interest for years, while he told himself the risk was theoretical. Eventually, Nolan slept. The next 3 weeks were not smooth. Anyone who tells you that the truth coming out is a clean and cathartic experience has probably never been in the room when it actually happens. The truth coming out is messy and contested and exhausting, and it looks, for a significant portion of the time, very much like the truth might not win. Graham's legal team filed a motion challenging the chain of custody of the blueprint documents. They argued that the legacy server records were unreliable due to age and potential corruption. They submitted an affidavit from a technical consultant, someone Nolan had never heard of. Told him something about the consultant, claiming that the measurement deviations, crashes on the crash structures fell within a contested engineering tolerance range. It was, Nolan thought, not incompetent. If you wanted to create enough ambiguity to survive a commission review without a clear finding, this was approximately how you'd do it. Problem, as Nolan had said to Sloane in the diner at 6 in the morning, was the physical machine. Dr. Reyes spent 11 days on the cars. She brought 2 additional independent engineers, one from a university aeronautical program, one from a rival racing organization's safety committee, neither of whom had any prior relationship with Apex Dominion. They measured everything. They documented everything. They ran thermal stress tests on replacement components to model what would have happened to the compromised originals under race conditions. Report was 214 pages. Nolan read all of it. The section on Mateo's car took 17 pages, and included a thermal modeling sequence showing in granular detail what would have happened to the crash structure in a specific type of lateral impact at high speed. The language was technical and precise and entirely bloodless, the way engineering documents are, and it was one of the most frightening things Nolan had ever read. The Racing Commission's formal finding came on a Tuesday afternoon. Was at the facility. When it arrived officially at the facility now, his maintenance badge deactivated, and his original engineering credentials restored, his title was still technically provisional, a designation Sloane had suggested to avoid any appearance of prejudging the investigation's outcome. He was in the secondary bay, working through a structural analysis on a component redesign, when Tessa knocked on the doorframe. "It's here," she said. They went upstairs together. Sloane was in her office with Sandra and the external legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Webb, who had the reading habits of someone who does not trust summaries and had therefore read all 214 pages herself. The commission report was on the table in front of them, its cover page face up. Sloane was standing at the window with a grinner in the posture of someone who has been waiting for something for long enough that the waiting has become physical. She turned when Nolan and Tessa came in. "Formal findings," she said. "Systematic and intentional modification of safety-critical components across 9 vehicles. Falsification of engineering records. Misattribution of original design work." She paused. "Graham is named as the responsible party on all counts." The room was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean practically?" Nolan said. Patricia Webb answered. "Permanent suspension of his engineering credentials in the Commission's jurisdiction. Civil liability for the modification costs and recall expenses. The falsification finding opens him to criminal referral, though that's the state attorney's discretion, not the Commission's." She folded her hands on the report. "His legal team will negotiate. This won't be fast. But the finding is unambiguous." Nolan looked at Sloane. She looked back at him with an expression that was not celebration he hadn't expected it to be. "Yes," he intervened. She looked like someone at the end who is trying to figure out how she feels now that it's over, and finding that feelings on arrival are rarely what you imagined they'd be on the way there. "Cars," he said. All 9 recalled. "Complete rebuild to original specification." She turned back to the window. "We're out of the next 2 races. Possibly the one after that, depending on how the rebuilds go." She said it without self-pity, just stating the accounting. Sponsors are asking questions. 2 of them are asking very loudly. "What are you telling them?" She was quiet for a moment. "The truth," she said, "that we found a safety problem, and we fixed it before anyone got hurt. That we're rebuilding to a higher standard than the cars were held to before." She turned around to face the room again. "Some of them will leave. I've accepted that." Nolan nodded. Thought about what it had cost her to make the recall decision. In the first place, not the money. The money was real. The public exposure, the admission that something in her company had been badly wrong for years. She was 30 years old, and she'd inherited an empire, and the empire had rot in its foundation that she hadn't built and hadn't chosen, and had still been responsible for, in the way that ownership is always responsibility regardless of origin. Could have managed it quietly. She could have found a way to contain it. He'd watched other companies do exactly that with exactly this kind of problem. And most of them had survived it, and the drivers had kept racing in cars that weren't safe enough, and the math had eventually caught up. She hadn't done that. He wasn't sure he'd have predicted that if you'd asked him in the main bay the morning she fired him. He'd have said she was her father's daughter, which he'd meant as a mixed thing a man Nolan had respected and found difficult in roughly equal measure. He'd have said she was smart and afraid, which was a common combination and didn't always produce good outcomes. He'd have been wrong about what she'd do when it mattered. He filed that away, not as a lesson exactly, more as a data point about the inadequacy of first readings. Graham Rourke came to the facility on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the commission finding, at a time when most of the engineering staff were in a design review meeting. He had called ahead not to Sloane, but to Patricia Webb, which was the appropriate channel at this stage, and he came without his lawyer, which was either brave or calculated or both. Sloane met him in the conference room. She brought Nolan not as a witness. Patricia had actual witnesses for that, but because she thought Nolan had a right to be there, and because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she wanted to see how it went. Graham looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. Dramatically, he was still the same square-jawed, silver-templed presence he'd always been, but something in his posture had changed. Some quality of authority that had previously seemed structural had turned out to be contingent, and without it, he sat in the conference room chair, like a man who was working harder than usual at appearing comfortable. He looked at Nolan when they came in. Nolan sat down across from him and waited. Graham said, "I'm here to make a formal statement of record," Sloane said. She sat at the head of the table. "Trisha will take it for the legal file." Graham nodded. He put his hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture, the kind you make when you're trying to stop them doing something else. Yet, he looked at the table surface rather than at either of them, and then he seemed to decide something, and he looked up. "The engine platform," he said. "The original design. Combustion architecture, the thermal management system, the safety structures, as originally built." He stopped. Started again. "All of it was Nolan Keats's work. I removed his name from the documentation in the second year after he left. I represented his designs as the result of team development under my direction." He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed a confession, to the point where the emotion has been separated from the words, which is its own kind of telling. "The modifications I made to the cars over the subsequent years were my decisions. Team recommendations, not inherited directions from previous engineering reviews." Pause. "I understood that some of those modifications reduced safety margins. Calculated that the probability of a specific failure scenario was acceptably low." The room was quiet. "It wasn't," he said. "Acceptably low." He looked at Nolan then, directly, for the first time since they'd sat down. "I want to say that clearly for the record. It wasn't." Looked back at him. He felt a complicated mixture of things that didn't resolve cleanly into anyone feeling not satisfaction, not absolution, not the particular relief he'd half expected. More like standing at the end of a very long road and finding that the destination looked smaller in person than it did from a distance. He said, "Is Matteo aware of what was wrong with his car?" Graham blinked. That wasn't the response he'd been prepared for. He should know, Nolan said. "He has a right to know what he was driving." He looked at Sloane. "Someone should tell him." Sloane nodded. She told him that afternoon. Matteo Cruz was in the team's temporary training facility when Sloane and Nolan arrived, working with a physical trainer on something involving resistance bands that he abandoned immediately when he saw who was coming. He was 23 and taller than Nolan expected, with an easy physicality and the particular watchful quality of a young athlete who has learned that the people who run things often arrive with news that changes your day. He listened to everything without interrupting. Sloane did most of the talking, with Nolan supplying the technical details where they mattered. Messi's key. Matteo's face went through several things while they talked. First, the focused attention of someone processing information, a slower, more interior expression as the implications landed. Something that wasn't quite fear, but was the retroactive version of it, the feeling of understanding a danger after you're already past it. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Nolan and said, "You're the one who fixed the seal on car 7, and then she fired you for it." He glanced at Sloane, not accusingly, just noting the fact. Nolan said. Matteo looked at him for a moment. "You came back anyway." "Yes." He nodded slowly, turning something over in his mind. "Why?" he said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, the direct, unperformed curiosity of someone young enough to still ask things plainly. Thought about how to answer that in a way that was true without being a speech. "'Cause I built those cars to keep people alive," he said. "And I didn't want to find out I'd failed at that by reading about it in the news." Teo looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "My sister watches every race. Front of the stands, every single one." He paused. "I want you to know that." Nolan nodded. He understood what was being said and what it cost to say it, and he didn't try to fill the space around it with anything. They rebuilt all 9 cars. It took 6 weeks. Nolan led the rebuild team with Tessa as his deputy, And he ran it the way he'd run his design work years ago, with the insistence that every engineer on the team understand not just what they were building, but why every measurement existed and what happened when it was violated. He says he was not, by temperament, a patient teacher. He was a precise one. Precision, it turned, was what the team had been missing. They'd been building to specifications without understanding the specifications, following numbers on a page. Without understanding the loads and temperatures and failure modes those numbers were protecting against. He made them understand. There were arguments. There were late nights and disagreements about timelines, and one significant blow-up between Nolan and a senior engineer named Park over a cooling channel redesign that Nolan rejected 3 times before the 4th version was right. Park thought the 3rd version was fine. Nolan explained in terms that were technically precise and interpersonally blunt why fine was not the standard they were working to. Park came back 2 days later with the 4th version and said, without preamble, "You were right about the flow dynamics." Nolan said, "Good work getting there." That was the extent of the reconciliation, but it was enough. They moved on. Tessa Marlowe, watching this from her workbench one afternoon, thought about what it looked like when someone led from actual knowledge rather than from position. She'd worked for Graham for 2 years before this and had understood, vague way, that something was off, that the engineering culture rewarded confidence over accuracy. Questions were tolerated, but not really welcomed. The gap between what was documented and what was physically true had been allowed to widen in ways she should have pushed on earlier, and hadn't. She pushed on things now. Nolan didn't always like it immediately. He always came back to it, which was new. She wrote that down in the back of her paper notebook, not as a professional note, but as a personal one. Push on things. The good ones come back to it. The cars were returned to competition on a gray Saturday in late autumn, 8 weeks after the recall. It wasn't a major race, a mid-tier circuit event, not a championship round, chosen deliberately as a return that would be watched, but not overexposed. Sloane had thought carefully about the optics, and then decided she was tired of thinking about optics, and had instead thought about what made operational sense, which turned out to be the same answer. Was in the pit lane for the first time in 8 years. He hadn't quite known what to expect from that. He'd expected something dramatic, maybe the kind of full-circle emotional experience that gets described in anniversary profiles and retirement speeches. What he actually felt was closer to ordinary. The smell of the place was the same. The sound was the same. The particular organized chaos of a pit lane before a race start was exactly as he remembered it, which was both comforting and slightly strange, like running into someone you used to know well and finding them essentially unchanged. He was wearing a team jacket navy blue, Apex Dominion, with his name and title on it, which Sloane had ordered without consulting him, and which he'd put on that morning without comment. Chief Design Engineer, it said in the small text under his name. Harvey Bell was at the far end of the pit lane, in his security guard uniform, standing near the barrier in exactly the relaxed, watchful posture of a man doing his job. Caught Nolan's eye once and gave a small nod. Nolan nodded back. Matteo's car went out in the second qualifying session and came in 4th fastest, which, given that the team had been out of competition for 8 weeks and was racing on newly rebuilt cars, was the kind of result that Nolan and Tessa high-fived quietly about in the engineering bay, and Sloane called a good sign in her post-session statement to the press. The race itself, Matteo ran 7th for most of the first half, picked up 2 positions when a car ahead of him had a tire issue, and finished 5th. He came over the radio after the checkered flag and said something to his race engineer that made the engineer laugh. Sets. Listening on the team frequency from the pit wall, didn't catch the words, but heard the tone and thought, there he is. There's the 23-year-old. He thought about his sister in the front of the stands, watching. Afterward, in the paddock, Sloane found him standing near the garage bay entrance with his jacket unzipped and a bottle of water, watching the post-race debrief activity of someone who has been around this long enough to know what each kind of noise means. 5th, she said. For the first race back, on rebuilt cars, with a team that's been off the circuit for 2 months, he said. I'll take 5th. She stood beside him. The paddock moved around them, team members, officials, the organized exit shuffle of a race weekend winding down. She'd been on calls for most of the day, managing sponsor conversations and press inquiries, and the ongoing legal proceedings that Graham's situation had generated, and she looked like all of it at once, which was accurate. "I want to show you something," she said. "When this cleared out slowly the way race paddocks do, all at once, and then suddenly completely. By 6 in the evening, the main facility at the circuit was quiet, and most of the team had gone to their hotel or their cars. Sloane took him to the team's dedicated transport bay, a large enclosed trailer, where the rebuilt cars would be loaded for the journey back. She'd been there during the loading. He knew, overseen it, the way her father used to oversee the loading, because he didn't trust it to anyone else, a habit she'd picked up without noticing and hadn't managed to put down. Trailer was half loaded, 2 cars already secured, 3 more staged for loading, and on the side wall of the trailer, mounted there recently enough that the installation hardware was still clean, was a printed panel. White background, company lettering, the kind of thing that goes on team equipment to establish identity and provenance. Apex Dominion Racing, engine platform designed by Nolan Keats. He looked at it for a moment. "It goes on every transport unit," Sloane said. "Every trailer, every equipment case that carries anything built on your platform." She paused. "The founding wall at the main facility is being updated next week. Your name beside my father's." He looked at the panel for a while longer. He felt something that was not the thing he might have expected to feel, not vindication, not the particular satisfaction of a debt repaid, nothing that grandiose. It was smaller than that and more durable. The feeling of a thing being named correctly after being misnamed for a long time. Simple as that. "You didn't have to do the trailer panels," he said. She said, "I wanted to." He looked at her. She was looking at the panel, not at him, in the way people look at things they've done that they're not ready to be thanked for yet. "Your father's notes," he said, "the ones from the archive." I recognized his handwriting on the margin annotations in the original combustion design files. He was thinking about the same problem I was: heat distribution at sustained high RPM. He had a different approach. She looked at him then. Did he have a better one? Nolan considered. No. It made me think of 2 things I wouldn't have thought of otherwise, no. So it was useful in a different way. She looked back at the panel. "That would have made him very happy," she said, "being useful in a different way than expected." A pause. "He was better at that than I am." "You pulled 9 cars, Nolan said. "Before you had everything. Before you were certain was going to cost you." She was quiet. "He would have been proud of that," Nolan said. He said it plainly, not to comfort her, just because it was true and she needed to hear it stated as a fact rather than an opinion. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I was terrified. I genuinely thought that if I pulled those cars and Rourke managed to spin it, I'd lose the company. Just the season. The company." She looked at her hands, kept thinking about what my father built and what it would mean if it fell apart, because I'd made a decision in the wrong direction. "You made the decision in the right direction. I made it scared," she said. "I want you to know that, in case it looked like I knew what I was doing." He looked at her. He thought about the hospital parking lot 8 years ago, about standing next to his car in the dark, knowing he'd stayed for the wrong thing, and unable to go back and make it different. About the weight of a choice that can't be undone, and the very slow, imperfect work of figuring out who you're going to be after it. "Most of the right things get done scared," he said. "That's not a disqualification." She nodded. They stood there in the quiet of the half-loaded trailer, with the evening coming in through the open end, and the smell of the track still on the air. And neither of them said anything more for a while, because there wasn't anything that needed to be added. Accepted the formal offer of chief design engineer on a Monday morning, see in Sloane's office, with one condition stated in writing and signed by both of them: he would be home every evening in time for dinner with his daughter. Race no deadline, sponsor call, crisis of lesser magnitude than a physical safety emergency would be grounds for overriding this. If something demanded him beyond that boundary, it would wait, or it would be handled by someone else. It would simply not get done. Yes, he'd intervened, and the company would learn to design its operations around the reality that people have lives as outside the building. Sloane signed it without amendment. The lawyers looked at it and said they'd never seen a provision like it in an engineering contract. Sloane told them to add it to the template. They blinked. She said it again. The first time Nolan was late home under the new arrangement was 6 weeks in, when a cooling system test ran long and he didn't get through the door until 6:42 instead of 6:15. Maisie was at the table doing homework. She looked at the clock and then at him. "You're late," she said. 27 minutes, he said. She looked back at her homework. "The rule is dinner." "I'm sorry." She appeared to consider whether this was sufficient. Then she said, "There's pasta. I made it myself." He looked at the stove. There was, indeed, pasta. It had been made with the confident imprecision of a 7-year-old who had watched the process enough times to approximate it, slightly overcooked, sauce unevenly distributed, more cheese than was strictly recommended. "It looks great," he said. "It's a little mushy," she said with honesty. "But it tastes okay. It did taste okay." He ate 2 bowls. 2 years passed the way time passes when life is mostly good, not quickly exactly, but without the particular weight that makes bad years feel endless. The company covered its competitive footing by the second season after the rebuild, finished third in the constructor standing, and the season after that, finished second. The legal proceedings around Graham Rourke settled into the slow institutional process of consequence that doesn't make news every week but grinds forward all the same. Mateo Cruz won his first race in the spring of that second year on a wet circuit in a race that most analysts had predicted he'd finish mid-pack. He led the last 11 laps and crossed the line 2.5 seconds ahead of the second-place car and came over the radio shouting something in Spanish that his race engineer understood, and Nolan, listening from the engineering station in the garage, did not, but whose meaning was entirely clear from the tone. After the podium ceremony, Mateo found Nolan in the garage. He'd intervened. He was still in his race suit, holding a bottle of champagne someone had given him, looking faintly dazed in the way that very young people look when something they've wanted for a long time actually arrives. He said, "I want you to know something." Nolan waited. "Every time I get in the car," Mateo said, "I think about what you told me, why you came back." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I drive differently because of it. Not slower, just I know what the car is. Someone built it to keep me safe." A pause. "I don't know how to explain exactly what that does, but it does something." Thought about designing the original platform 12 years ago in a room that smelled of coffee and printer toner, running thermal calculations on a whiteboard while other engineers argued about lap times. He'd been 20 years old, roughly young enough to believe that if you built something right, the rightness would hold regardless of what happened to it afterward. He'd been wrong about that. The rightness didn't hold on its own. It needed to be defended, maintained, reaffirmed against the constant pressure of expedience and corner cutting and the slow drift of what's acceptable. It needed people who understood why every measurement existed and were willing to hold the line on it. "Drive well," Nolan said. Mateo grinned a full, unguarded grin, the kind that has no performance in it. "I'm going to win the championship," he said. "I know," Nolan said. "Car will hold." The race Nolan would remember most happened in the third autumn of his return. It was a late-season circuit, one of the fastest on the schedule. Concrete barriers close on both sides, the kind of track where the margin for error is measured in centimeters. Mateo had qualified second and was running third in the race when, on lap 31, a car ahead of him made contact with a barrier and shed debris across the racing line. Mateo hit the debris at 187 miles per hour, was watching on the monitor in the garage, and saw it happen in the compressed, slightly unreal way you see a crash on a screen, the car going sideways, the barrier contact on the left side, the violent deceleration, car sliding to a stop in the gravel trap with its left side crumpled and the right side intact. The garage went quiet. Then the radio crackled and Mateo's voice came through, breathless and jagged and absolutely present. "I'm okay. Car's done, but I'm okay." The garage exhaled, sat back in his chair, and looked at the monitor for a moment, and then looked away. Not because it was too much, but because it was suddenly not necessary. The image was already in him, already being stored somewhere that wasn't the short-term memory, and looking at it more wasn't going to add anything useful. Tessa was at the station next to him. She said left side absorbed it. He said, original spec crash structure. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was an entire conversation in that exchange that neither of them said out loud, because saying it out loud would have been too much, too large for the words available, too specific for the general forms that language offers when you need them most. Matteo climbed from the car on the screen. He was moving normally. He raised his hand once to the marshals to indicate he was unhurt. He stood beside the wreckage for a moment, looking at it the way you look at something that was carrying you and is now simply an object. And then he took off his helmet and walked toward the medical car. Left the garage at the end of the race, before the post-race debrief, which was irregular and which Tessa would handle in his absence. He signed out at the main desk. He signed out at the main desk and walked to the parking truck for approximately 4 minutes, doing nothing in particular. He thought about a measurement, 68 millimeters, the distance between a calculated safety margin and a real human life, expressed in the language of engineering, which is the language of accountability dressed up as mathematics. He thought about Matteo's sister in the front of the stands, watching. He drove home. Maisie was at the kitchen table. When he came in, she was 9 now, and the homework was harder. And she'd developed the habit of working at the kitchen table rather than her desk because, as she'd explained, the kitchen had better light and also snacks were closer. She was reading something for school, a chapter book he didn't recognize, and she looked up when he came in. "You're early," she said. "Race ended early," he said. She studied him for a moment with the evaluating attention she'd always had, the thing that was so much her own and also so much her mother's. "Did something happen?" "Yes," he said. "It was okay, though. Everyone's okay." She looked at him for one more second, doing her own accounting. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back at her book. He made dinner. Nothing elaborate. There wasn't time for elaborate, and elaborate wasn't really the point. He made the things he knew how to make reliably, the ones Maisie ate without argument. And they ate at the kitchen table with her book beside her plate and the news on low on the television in the other room, which he turned off because he didn't need to hear more about the crash from people who hadn't been there. After dinner, she showed him what she was working on at school, a project about things people build and why they last. She'd chosen bridges. She had diagrams printed out, annotated in her careful, slightly irregular handwriting, with questions written in the margins, the same way her grandfather's notes had margins full of questions. Nolan didn't know that, and Sloane would have found it remarkable if she had. "Why do bridges fall down?" Maisie asked. It was a genuine question, not a leading one. She wanted to know. He thought about it seriously, the way she deserved. Usually, he said, because the people who built them didn't account for something they didn't know to account for. Because the people who maintained them stopped paying attention to small problems until they became large ones, until it came stun ones. She wrote that down. "Can you build a bridge that won't fall down?" she said. Thought about car 7, about 68 millimeters, about the thermal model in Dr. Reyes's 214-page report and a 23-year-old climbing out of wreckage and raising his hand. "You can build one that's very unlikely to," he said. "But then you have to keep being responsible for it. You can't just build it and walk away." He paused. "The building isn't the hard part. The staying responsible, that's harder." She considered this. Then she wrote that down too, and he had the feeling, watching her write, she was storing it somewhere more permanent than the notebook. The way that children store things adults say, at the right moment, in the places that shape things. He helped her until 9 o'clock. Then she went to bed, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house, with the project materials still spread in front of him and the distant sound of the neighborhood settling into the night. He thought about the founding wall at the Apex Dominion main facility, which he'd seen 2 weeks ago with his name on it. He'd stood in front of it for less time than he'd expected. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered less than he'd thought it would, which was not the same thing. The name on the wall was accurate now. It was true. That was enough. What he thought about more, sitting at the kitchen table, was the fractions worksheet from the first night. Card drawn in the margin. The small stick figure with the helmet. Fast, stay safe. 7-year-old logic. applied to a problem that men with master's degrees had been unable to hold together. Keep the speed. Keep the protection. Don't let the pressure of one make you sacrifice the other. He hadn't built anything new, yet the formal design work was just beginning. The next generation platform still in its earliest stages. A set of ideas on grid paper and a list of constraints, and the particular excitement of an empty problem waiting to be filled. He had opinions about where the thermal architecture could improve. He had a sketch done on the back of a parts receipt 2 weeks ago during a dull sponsor meeting, of a cooling channel modification that might gain them 8% flow efficiency without touching the structural margins. He would work on it tomorrow. At the facility, in the engineering bay, with Tessa and the team, and all the noise and argument and iterative failure that real design work actually involves, nothing like the clean version in retrospect. And then he would come home. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked down the hall. The nightlight was on. Maisie's door was at its angle, not quite open, not quite closed, the exact angle. He had not fixed everything. He had not undone the years. He had not recovered the original time, the 4 years with Maisie that had been partly shadowed by his absence into himself. The 8 years in which his work had existed in the world under someone else's name, while drivers climbed into cars that were slowly being made less safe. He had not fixed any of that. It wasn't available to be fixed. What was available was this, the next thing done right, and the thing after that, and the slow accumulation of days in which the work was true, and the man doing it was present, actually present, just physically in the room. That was all that was ever actually available to anyone. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to bed. He was home.